Hi, I'm Ken. Let's go through something a little simpler today, my baby banknote stamps. This is the first page of my baby banknote stamps. It's a little hard to tell from the layout, but this page is complete. We'll get into that in a moment. Calling these the baby banknotes implies that there must be banknote issues. But like the Muppet Babies, or the Baby Looney Tunes, these baby banknote stamps came after their original, larger versions. These earlier banknote stamps came out starting in 1870 and are a little larger than the baby banknotes that came out starting in 1890, 20 years later. The banknote stamps are called banknote stamps because of the printing companies that made them: the National Banknote Company, the Continental Banknote Company, and the American Banknote Company, which each, one after the other, held the contract to produce these larger stamps through their 20-year run. The last company with the printing contract was the American Banknote Company. In 1890, they got the first contract to print the next series of stamps with a new, smaller size. Despite the fact that these stamps are called baby banknote stamps, besides being smaller and printed by the American Banknote Company, these stamps are not similar in design to their larger predecessors. Sometimes you might hear this series called the First Bureau Issues. The bureau that's referred to in that name is the U.S. Bureau of Engraving and Printing. That confused me at first, but the explanation is very simple. In 1883, after the first printing of these stamps by the American Banknote Company, there was a new bidding process for printing these stamps. The Bureau of Engraving and Printing won that bid. Big surprise. Anyway, when the BEP took over the plates and the design, they made a small design change, adding triangles to the top corners of these stamps. That triangle makes it really easy to tell which stamps were printed by which organization, but makes naming this set a little harder. Clearly they belong together as a series. That's what I've done on this page. But calling these stamps the baby banknotes implies that they were all printed by the American Banknote Company, which isn't true. And calling these stamps the First Bureau Issues implies that they were all printed by the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, which is also not true. I could have labeled this page with both names, but I decided to call it the baby banknotes page, because the size is the most important feature of these stamps for me. Now you might note at the top what looks like a flub on my part. I labeled this page as Baby Banknotes with banknotes as 2 words. Banknote with 1 word is what we call our paper money. But at the time, the company name for the American Banknote Company used 2 words. The company exists today as the AB Corp, which is a little hard to read because they spell it ABC in caps followed by ORP in lowercase. My brain wants to say ABC Corp, but nope. Anyway, today the AB Corp spells the word banknote in their name as 1 word. I'd like to say that I spelled it with 2 words on purpose, but honestly it's a happy accident. I'm a terrible speller. Back to the stamps. These first 3 strips have my lower value stamps from the American Banknote Company on the first strip. The second and third strips have the stamps from the BEP. Actually, there are 3 types of stamps from the BEP printings. They're really easy to tell apart. The first series was on unwatermarked paper, the ones we were just looking at. The second series is on watermarked paper, a double-line USPS watermark, which is a pretty easy watermark to see, thankfully. The third series is in new colors to comply with new color requirements from the Universal Postal Union. We'll get to the other 2 series in a moment. This first page of mine has the stamps up to the 5-cent denomination, but you might wonder why I have 2 strips for the BEP stamps when I fit all the American banknote stamps on just 1 strip. The first hint comes from how many copies of the 2-cent Washington stamps I have. For the American banknote stamps, there are 2 distinct color variants. The first one is Scott 219D in what's called the lake color. It's essentially a purple red. The second one is the more common Scott 220 in what's called the carmine color, a lighter red that's not quite what you might call pink. I have 2 copies of the Scott 220 because to my eye they are slightly different shades. For the BEP stamps, there are 5 different catalog numbers, Scott 248 to 252. But these are not all just shade differences. There's also a difference with these stamps in the way the triangles are cut. For that first triangle type, type 1, there are 3 listed shades, a pink, a carmine lake, and a carmine. There's also minor variants for a rose color and a scarlet color, but I have a hard enough time telling these apart. Again, let me warn you that you can't distinguish colors from pictures on the internet, but knowing roughly what these colors look like, And looking at a small pile of these stamps, you should be able to see the differences and based on relative colors, figure them out. It's hard, but not impossible. In the second triangle type, the lines are thinner in the inner triangle, but they do continue all the way through the gap between the inner and outer triangles. For this second triangle, there's one major color, carmine, but there's also a minor variant in scarlet. Finally, in the third triangle type, the lines disappear in the space between the inner and outer triangles. This third type also comes in carmine with a minor variant in scarlet. So looking at my stamps again, for the American banknote stamps, I have both major catalog numbers and 2 copies of the carmine stamp that I see as different shades. And for my BEP stamps, I have an example of each of the major color variants. Perhaps I'll dig into finding those minor shades someday. Now's a good time to point out that there are 2 colors for the 1-cent BEP stamps. The Franklin stamp comes in an ultramarine and a blue color. I like to think of ultramarine as a lighter blue, although color nerds would probably say there's something else going on there. I have examples of each of those. There's one other thing to be on the lookout for with the 2-cent carmine stamps from the American Banknote Company. That Scott 220 stamp. Some of the 2s are said to have caps on them. The stamp on the left shows the leftmost 2 with a cap on it. That's stamp 220A. The one on the right shows both 2s with caps on them. That's 220C. Here's a closer look. There's some debate about whether there should exist or whether there does exist a 220B with a cap on just the rightmost 2. Some say that examples like that are just a temporary bit of crud on the plate and not an actual permanent plate flaw like the other 2. So now it might make sense why I've got 2 strips for the BPS stamps and why I've left the extra blank space. There are so many legitimate 2-cent variants that I needed space for them, and I wanted to align the 3, 4, and 5-cent stamps vertically. If I find more shades or any of those cap varieties, I'll probably fill in that space. But there's one more strip on this page. That's for the color variants that came out in 1898. Franklin changes color from blue to green. The Universal Postal Union had just put out new rules for the colors that standard postage rates should have across all countries. The postcard rate should always be green, hence the change to the Franklin stamp color. The 10-cent stamp in this series had been green and was changed to brown at the same time to avoid confusion. And the letter rate should always be red according to the rules. The stamp on the left was the old carmine color, which you might say was close enough to red, but it was changed to something more properly red, the stamp on the right. In this case, both the right stamp, Scott 252, and the new red stamp, Scott 279B, have the third type of triangle in the corner, the one where the lines don't run through the space between the 2 triangles. Given how colors fade with time and how close these 2 are, they might be hard to tell apart. Fortunately, there are a lot of other little differences that help with identification. The Swedish Tiger stamp identification page shows a few of them. In an effort to reduce confusion, Scott changed how it described these triangles in later editions. They used to be called type 1, 2, and 3 triangles, but now they've switched to calling them type A, B, and C triangles. They call the stamps that go with the type A triangles type 1 stamps. Same with 2 and B. But for the type C triangles, they have a type 3 stamp from the earlier series and a type 4 stamp used exclusively for this new red stamp, Scott 279B. So that's the nomenclature you see in this image. Our Scott 279B issue is referred to as a Type 4 stamp. The first difference noted is an elongated toga button. Scott calls this a shaded toga button. Second, there are more dots in the ear area. Scott also mentions that the lines on the sleeve are darker and there's at least one strand of hair that's darker and longer. Third, according to Scott, the right edge of the T in 2 is more curved, although I can never see this in a real stamp. Swedish Tiger shows the T in cents as his example, and Scott circles the T in 2. I tend to trust Swedish Tiger more, but still recognize that there is some confusion about which T to look at if you use this clue. Scott also mentions that the background lines break into the white oval next to the U in US. I find that this is a helpful clue. Often with these stamps, the cancel obscures some of these details. You'll have to look hard at the various differences to convince yourself that you've got an actual Type 4 stamp. Oh, and the later stamps are noticeably more red than the earlier ones, so there's that. My 1991 catalog only mentions the color difference for identification, so apparently for 100 years that alone was enough to figure these out, it might still be good enough. Let's move on now. On this page, I have the lower value watermarked stamps. Again, this is the full set. I could have fit these on the previous page and moved the color variants to this page. That would have fit the timeline better for sure, but then I wouldn't have been able to see the color differences together on one page. This layout works for me. You'll see that I also have 4 2-cent Washingtons here. The stamps on the first strip are Scott numbers 265, 6, and 7. They're just type 1, 2, and 3 triangles, or type A, B, and C if you prefer. That 2 cent on the second strip is one of the minor color variations, a type 3 pink that I just added to the collection. Scott 267A. I think it's a rather nice example. Finally, this is my last page of these issues. It's quite sparsely populated because these stamps start to get expensive. At the peak of this expense is this $5 stamp featuring Supreme Court Chief Justice John Marshall. The least expensive of these is the watermarked Scott 278, cataloging at over $600. But if you want a mint, never hinged version of the unwatermarked stamp, that catalogs for over $15,000. Phew, that's out of my price range. I have one strip for each of the series variants here. Those who follow me might remember that I mark my album when I have a stamp that catalogs for more than $50. There are no marks on this page, although quite a few of these catalog in the $25 range. I tend to think that these lower value stamps actually sell for about 10% of the catalog value, so there's a lot of nice stamps here, but nothing that breaks the bank. One last thing on this page. You might notice a 10-cent stamp on its side on that second strip. That's what's known as a jumbo or jumbo margin stamp. You should be able to see that the bottom margin is larger than normal. It's unusual, but not notably more valuable. It's just too big to stand up in the mount. I think we'll stop here and make this one of my shorter episodes. There's a lot of nice stamps in this series. I think it's very accessible to newer collectors. I hope you have fun sorting through yours.